Well, as various political leaders took to podiums across the country, they spoke about the state of human rights in South Africa today. Well, joining me to discuss their perspectives is political analyst Dr Somadoda Fikeni, who joins us now from our Pretoria studios. Dr Fikeni, it's safe to say that next year's general election was in the minds of the various speakers as they framed their messages today.
There is no doubt that this Human Rights Day might actually be reflected on as the launch of various campaigns, and it gives us a preview of what is likely to be the area of emphasis for various parties. You may have seen that a majority of parties are emphasizing on socio-economic justice and as such on the issue of land transformation. And you do have the party like the DA, which has chosen the highly sensitive and symbolic issue of life acid demeni and the issue of the vote of no confidence, but not emphasizing much on the issue of socio-economic transformation. I think the battle lines are drawn, but one thing though reflected is that in this partisan environment, not even a national day such as the Human Rights Day brings the country together, unites everybody to focus on some of the basic minimum national interests. Every party has its own agenda, and that is reflective of a fragmented society politically.
Well, let's take them one by one, if you like. It's certainly at least the three major ones. Let's start with EFF leader Julius Malema, pulling no punches and saying that the call for land is not reverse racism, but rather a call for dignity.
Certainly, I do think that the EFF is sensing that it could grow to be the main opposition party, so you may have it pulling apart from the DA as much as possible because they may be contesting for that second position, or even where possible in provinces where they could govern with coalition. Therefore, because of that, EFF will raise the issue of land, the issue of wealth redistribution, and its radical economic program as much as possible, competing in that space perhaps with the ruling party, with the other new parties, with the trade union movement and the alliance parties such as the SACP.
It is, of course, Human Rights Day. One of the other messages from Julius Malema was how black people are treated in South Africa, saying they're not treated as human, and really pushing the envelope by saying they've got little to celebrate on a day like this.
That is the point if they position themselves to the other extreme left and they position themselves as the champion of the radical economic transformation. You may see this rhetoric and sometimes being pushed to the limit as we go for elections come next year, because one suspects that the main contestation in the minds of many South Africans will not only be the end of corruption, but also will be the issue of saying after 2 decades or 24 years, the main issue that has not been resolved in any concrete way is the one of the socio-economic transformation, is the one of land, is the one of the apartheid and colonial geography that we see around. And on the other side, it might put pressure on the DA if in their Congress they are still seen as primarily protecting property and not pushing hard on the issue of transformation. That may actually undercut them come next year, because the shift on the focus on socio-economic issues now and transformation in essence has become key.
Of course, Malema also highlighted the lack of consequences for officials and their political principles, mentioning life esidimeni, mentioning children who still drown in pit latrines. But it was also, interestingly, a message that was echoed by the Deputy President, who said that past leaders might be ashamed of the very same.
Certainly, I do think that one of the biggest crises we face as a country, and the new government will have to deal with that and come up with a credible plan. One is the gap between policy intentions and the implementation of those, the state capacity to deliver, and the leadership capacity to act with courage and decisiveness. Still one big challenge in the country, because sometimes some of the leaders see things as a public relations exercise rather than as deep social justice issue that needs conviction to resolve. And secondly, I do think that indeed there are instances where there seem to have been very little or no consequences when leaders promise to do things but not deliver them. Or when some of the bureaucrats are still busy with their own jostling and internal, dynamics without delivering. So that particular message, I do think that should send a signal to government, should send a signal to municipalities that implementation and a demonstrable and credible plan to say we will implement or we have a record of implementing is going to be very important going forward.
The ANC is always going to be burdened by the sins of incumbency. How long can their leaders, though, make these admissions as if their party is not the one that's in power?
Well, I don't think it will be for too long. The ANC has been suffering progressive decline since 2009. It's reached its peak in 2004. From 2009 onwards, into the more recent local government elections in 2016, ANC has been losing its majority, although incrementally. And it was a lot more dramatic and emphatic in the urban metro areas, amongst the workers, the youth, the minorities, as well as the black middle class. So they'll have to do something special to win back that particular trust, not only by fighting corruption, but creating an effective, capable state and professionalizing the bureaucracy, because the patronage and some of the deployments have actually crippled the ability of the state to operate, and also some degree of stability amongst the leaders or cabinet ministers appointed, amongst the DGs, because the turnover that we have seen in the last decade, where there was almost a cabinet reshuffle every year, and even worse last year when we had 2 such cabinet reshuffles. Very often new ministers come in, you have a purge, you have change of boards because they want to establish their patronage. Now, if you continue doing that, you can't do that and still hope to have a capable state.
Meanwhile, of course, that brings us to the DA. Now, in Gauteng, they want a motion of no confidence against Premier Makura's government. We also heard the leader there, Musimaimane, saying there's not going to be any closure for the victims of Life Esidimeni without accountability. But of course, anything he says is now undermined by the messaging from the Western Cape Premier, who tweeted criticizing the same families of those victims.
In fact, I do think that DA has a dilemma, and most of their programs and reactions since the appointment or the election of Cyril Ramaphosa has shown more of a search for dramatic, symbolic programs rather than a long-term, deep analysis of what their reaction ought to be. Some of the things, such as the vote of no confidence, which is used serially and at times in a light manner as part of election campaign, in the long run, it may actually undermine their coalitions around the country, because the same medicine may be meted against them. They ought to have given themselves time to understand that Life Esidimeni, just like Marikana, are very sensitive issues that need to unite the country on how best to deal with them. And they ought to have understood that the judgment by the former Deputy Chief Justice was widely accepted. Therefore, anything that is seen to be using this as a political football is likely to undermine their long-term strategy, because where the pressure is coming is what program they come up with in terms of the socio-economic transformation, and also the fixation with tweeting by the Premier of the Western Cape, where she always gets it wrong in many instances, and the party has to deal with that particular reputational challenge. It's one thing that they have to deal with, and let alone that some in the public will be looking at how the leaders such as Patricia de Lille as well as Helen Zille are treated, because very easily, if they are treated differently, the racial connotation may be raised.
Well, that is our political wrap of the day, then with political analyst Dr Somadoda Fikeni on the line there in our Pretoria studios. Now, there were mixed